Hello. So thank you for taking the time to be here with me today. And let me just make sure I'm recording this. It looks like I am. Um, so I'm here today to talk to you about the subject that I've been researching for the past 10 weeks in class. And the subject kind of evolved and changed as I got into it. And so what I started out um, working on is not what I ended up working on. My project is the rural-urban divide from a social worker's perspective, and it's a very diverse topic. I started out looking for um, local resources to do a subject on, and I came across a lot of resources with the local agricultural extension and the conservation district, and looking at things that they're battling, helping people with old sanitation and water quality and health issues related to that. And then the topic just kind of evolved into something that I wasn't very aware of myself, which is the rural-urban divide as it is defined. So there are some very interesting facts on this topic. The rural locations generally have a higher percent of disabled people, and this may have a lot to do with opportunities to find work that they're able to do once they get injured. And they tend to have lower wages, less access to health care, a higher percentage of disabled people, as I said, and higher tobacco use. There's also a much larger water consumption, and yet most rural places are always saying that they need more in order to meet their needs for different things. And so there's a story in the handout that I've given you that talks about a gal that I know that became disabled at a young age because of lack of education. She had a very, very physical job and physical upbringing, and she ended up becoming disabled at a young age, and in a larger setting that may not have happened because she may have had access to types of work that she could do, but there was really nothing in her location that she could do. And then with raising her children, and she has great children that she raises on the farm, and they have animals and they collect eggs every day and that. But her children are really at a technological disadvantage as they've tried to take pre-college courses in their regular school setting. They don't have access to internet out where they live, and the internet at the school is really slow. The school actually ended up opening later hours just so they could stay online longer to get their projects done. So let me give you a little bit of history about the topic. And the urban and rural divide is definitely an old one, and it back in the beginning of civilization, the church was probably the original social worker. They provided food and housing and people in need, medical care and things like that. And back then or even before that time, they say it took 9 farmers to feed one city person. Today, one farmer supports 99 urban people. And so, let's see, next slide. The urban-rural divide was, like I said before, originally small towns and villages and communities helped people out in the rural settings, but there started to become a much larger problem in urban settings as there was a disconnect between community and people. And so that's when Jane Addams, that we've talked about and heard about, and others like her, started forming social services for people. And she was inspired by organizations, social reform done in London. And so it was the industrialization that brought on that bigger need, where in the past community would take care of people. Now there were so many people that there was less community in the urban settings. So in a sense, social work developed because of the lack of community ties that were once common in the rural settings. The industrial era in the urban settings, 60% of Americans lived in rural settings, and so more people were rural, and people flocked to the bigger cities for work. But today, definitely more people live in those urban settings because of job opportunities, factories, and things like that. And so there continues to be more emphasis on helping people in those larger populations. In the industrial area, in the rural areas, farmers were actually better off. They were very self-sufficient. It defined their rural living. And then the inventions of different kinds of transportation started bringing people to the country quite a bit. In 1908, there was the Commission on Country Life that was formed, and it sought to improve the conditions for people in rural areas. And this was kind of grown out of the fact that people were starting to see the disconnect as they were able to travel to these places a lot more. The movement focused on preserving traditional life, and they established all kinds of agricultural programs, the extension offices and the national organizations to improve rural living. The Depression era was a place where a lot of farmers were definitely better off in the beginning. They were still able to produce their own food and make their own clothing out of flour sacks and things like that. They were very innovative. They were used to living frugally, and so they fared really well in the beginning. But then when there was nobody to buy their cash crops, they couldn't pay their bank loans, and that's when people started losing the farm. And some of them would start to migrate to cities for help, or do what they could to survive out where they were. In the urban places, the Depression definitely increased demand for social services. The homeless started to cluster in shanty towns, and people from the rural areas often headed that way too when they couldn't find help where they were. And there was something called the New Deal that enacted special relief programs aimed at the homelessness under the Fair Transient Services that operated from 1933 to 1935. So post-World War II, there became an even greater rural-urban divide. People in metropolitan places could be anonymous. People living in rural places were still very much the community oriented, and so the mindsets became completely different in these places. Rural areas actually started to get harsher on religion and keeping out outsiders such as immigrants and colored people, and they clung to the Prohibition Acts. They definitely saw that as something that was anti-Christian to be drinking, and so there were some acts along the way allowing rural places to establish advisors through the land grant universities and help spread technologies to rural living areas. And there's that the American Country Life Association that I mentioned that developed in 1919, the American Association for the Highway Improvement, to fix transportation back and forth to these areas, because we really needed to be able to get the food to market, basically, and that became critical. A lot more organizations started to pop up, such as the 4-H clubs, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America. There became more of an emphasis on public funding for schools. And so the rural really started to come into the light. Today, there are numerous, overwhelming resources on the urban-rural divide. The Rural Social Workers Caucus, the First National Institute on Social Workers in Rural Areas, was hosted by the University of Tennessee in 1976, and the annual National Institute on Social Workers and Human Services in Rural Areas program was formed. And so we really start seeing a lot more books and reading and stuff being brought to light on the differences in these areas. And so there's one person in particular that I found, Michael Met from NORC, the nonpartisan and objective research organization at the University of Chicago. And he really enacted some incredible research to be done on all sorts of areas of development for rural health systems, research, evacuation planning, individual training, health activities, research funding. And he really has a variety of stuff that covers from the micro to the meso to the macro. There are think tanks and thought groups and stuff to try to develop more ideas for what is needed. And then there's research on those individual ideas. And then there's training to be carried out to the individual communities that will carry out that training to the individual people. And I've seen some of that in my small rural community here. We've seen evacuation planning training and finding ways out of our different areas for mass problems such as fires and things like that that can devastate the rural areas. So, and with that growing awareness, I should say too that Met has said that in his one article that right now is the time to act. It was the 2016 election that really brought awareness to the problem, and people started to see the rural-urban divide for what it is. Here's a graph that kind of shows metro and non-metro areas, and so you can see where people cluster. Then the Denver Post did a series of articles that a lot of people have mentioned and are aware of. As I researched this topic, everybody said go to those articles in the Denver Post. And the articles cover a wide variety of topics. Everything from mental health care and law enforcement's ability to enforce things when they see people with mental health disparities, water resources and pollution, and lack of educational things, mental health services, and that. So there are numerous articles done there, and a lot of kind of heart-touching videos. If you go through those articles and watch each one, you really get a sense for what's going on in different areas. And so one of the let me see, solutions that I wanted to talk about is really what is already being done. It's bringing the topic of the rural-urban divide to the public's attention, and that's the big thing. Right now, the more people are aware of this divide, and I have to say for myself, I really wasn't aware of the topic as it is labeled. I knew that the divide existed, but I didn't realize how much research and attention had been drawn to it. And so we just really need to keep doing research and finding out what it is that's going to help us and help a lot of people. For instance, in my community, we do have mental health counselors, but we don't have people that specialize in a lot of the new age therapies and cognitive behavioral therapy, lens, mindfulness, meditation practices, and that's something that I hope to bring to this area. But if I wanted to experience it myself, I would have to get online and find some sort of way to do it on there. And so I tried to research some of those online therapists. I found that well, I couldn't for sure find any that accepted health insurance, and so I'm not really sure that those programs are up and running and certified like they should be. It's something that you would have to pay out of cash or out of pocket for. And so the code of ethics, as we look at it, Section 6 talks about the ethical responsibility for the broader society, and that definitely relates to this topic as we talk about the divide. Section 6.01 relates to living conditions and basic human needs in this area. And when my mother was working in the medical profession, we find a lot of people that are shut-ins, that don't leave, that don't go very far, that don't travel, can't travel for medical assistance. And in that story that I have in the handout, it mentions that issue with my friend's mother, as they've had health problems here and there. Her mother's had a stroke, and it's over 45 minutes to get to the hospital in that area. And so Section 1.05 relates to cultural awareness and social diversity. And that's really important on this topic too, because we don't want to be going into a rural area and try to take over and try to make it something that it's not. And it is there. A lot of rural areas do have a completely different sense of community and religion and things like that, but some of that has been lost too. And so we really need to go into a place and find out what they're like before we start trying to change things or make new policies. The interventions at the micro level, we're looking at teachers, mental health agencies, big brothers and sisters, 4-H, and the individual people in those agencies who are going to deliver services to individuals, like the extension and the 4-H programs. At the meso, it would be making sure that all of these education agencies are well educated, that they have the most updated information for rural issues, and focusing on larger groups like school to provide some educational topics. At the macro level, we're looking into legislation that can bridge the gap. And this is going to, of course, include funding for different services that are needed in different communities. Telemed is one that I mentioned, for mental health services to be delivered via distance. And there are quite a few other issues, and they're at the macro level in legislation that we really need to explore more, but there's been a lot of research done. So there's the references, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to explore this topic and present it to you. It is such a small piece of what I have been looking at over the last couple of months on this topic. It's such a huge topic that now that I've delved into it on a broader sense, I would really like to take a next step and be able to focus in on some areas of this related to health and sanitation, and people in the United States being able to all have access to clean drinking water and proper sewage disposal and things like that I've seen as a disparity. Thank you for listening.